It sounded almost too easy. Sit alone in a tower, scan the forest for smoke, a paycheck, and something good for the resume. The tower sat high in the mountains of California, in a place called Tomhead, surrounded by endless forest. I parked my truck at the cutoff and hiked the last stretch, my pack biting into my shoulders. The tower rose on 4 wooden legs. Inside, the small room was cramped but organized. Maps pinned to the walls, a narrow bed, and a fold-out table. On the desk sat the radio, a machine that crackled with static even when no one was speaking. Below the tower, a small storage shed held my tools and weeks' worth of food. Once I climbed up and pulled the hatch closed, the world felt very far away. The first few weeks passed smoothly. Every hour I swept the hills with my binoculars, noting wind direction and visibility. I read books, brewed coffee on the little stove, and learned the voices of the birds. But the longer I stayed alone, the more every sound stood out. The groan of the tower, footsteps that turned out to be squirrels. Silence stopped being peaceful and started feeling watchful. About a month in, I went for a walk around the base of the tower. Something near the tree line caught my eye, a shape that didn't belong. As I got closer, my stomach tightened. It was a figure, roughly human-sized, made from sticks, wire, and tangled roots. Its arms stretched outward like a scarecrow. There was no face, just an empty, tangled suggestion of a head. It looked deliberately placed. No hikers ever came this way. I grabbed a fallen branch and shoved the thing hard. It toppled over with a brittle crack. I dragged the broken pieces deeper into the woods and left them scattered. The next morning, while eating breakfast, I glanced out the window and froze. The figure stood upright again, exactly where it had been before, whole, intact, watching the tower. I took the stairs 2 at a time, searching the ground. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I radioed my supervisor, Tom, but he just chuckled. He told me to break it again. So I did more than break it. I smashed it with a hammer, splintering every joint. Then I took a shovel and buried the remains far from the tower. I felt foolish for being scared. 2 days passed. Then, one evening as the sun dropped low, I smelled smoke. Not distant wildfire smoke. This was close. I looked down. The figure was back again, and flames were flickering at its base, catching on the dry grass. I ran down and stomped until my boots smoked. Someone had lit it on purpose. The next day, a ranger named Lisa arrived. She examined the burn marks and shook her head. She said locals sometimes do this to scare lookouts off. She loaded the remains of the figure into her truck and left. Weeks went by. I started to relax. My season was almost over. But the last bad night began quietly. Just after midnight, heavy footsteps echoed below the tower. Not one set, many. I crept to the window. Dark shapes moved around the base. 12 figures, hooded and silent. They carried sticks and bundles. One struck a match. The smell of gasoline hit me seconds later. I grabbed the radio, screaming for help. "Tom, they're starting a fire!" Flames climbed the wooden legs of the tower, crackling loud and hungry. The men stepped back to watch. One looked up at me. His face stayed hidden in the shadow of his hood. "You shouldn't be here," he called. Smoke filled the room. The floor was getting hot. I opened the window. It was 15 feet down. I tied a sheet to the railing, climbed out and hung for a breathless second. I let go. I hit the ground hard, pain screaming through my ankle. I scrambled into the trees. "He's getting away!" someone shouted. I ducked behind a boulder, pressing my hand over my mouth as footsteps passed inches away. Then sirens wailed in the distance. Blue and red flashing lights cut through the forest. The men scattered into the dark. By the time help arrived, the tower was half destroyed. My belongings were burned. The police asked questions, faces, names. I had none. Days later, an officer told me there was no proof anyone else had been there. Rain had erased the tracks. He spoke gently, suggesting isolation made me imagine threats. I knew what I saw. I never went back to lookout work. I took a city job, surrounded by people and noise. But even now, I double-check my locks. I listen for footsteps. Isolation doesn't just make you see things. Sometimes it hides people who are waiting for no one to be watching. To help out with the fire lookouts in Colorado's Pike National Forest. It was meant to be simple work, quiet, routine, a reset. My uncle ran one of the towers, an old wooden structure balanced on iron legs atop a jagged outcrop called Devil's Head. The name fit. From a distance, the rock jutted up from the forest like a skull breaking the surface of the trees. My uncle's name was Harold, though almost no one called him that. To everyone who knew him, he was Doc. Years ago, he'd taught classes on rocks and minerals. He was the kind of man who could hold a room spellbound talking about quartz veins and fault lines. He was nearly 80 now, his joints stiff and unreliable after an illness that never quite left him. But he refused to give up the tower. He loved the solitude, the long hours watching the horizon for smoke, the soft crackle of the radio breaking the silence. In late April, he invited me up for the afternoon. "Bring your shovel," he told me over the phone. "There's good topaz up here if you know where to look. We'll dig a bit, then have coffee in the tower." I drove up Rampart Range Road under a pale blue sky. When I reached the turnout near the tower, Doc was already waiting outside the small cabin at the base, leaning on his cane. He wore his usual outfit, a white cap pulled low, a faded plaid shirt, and heavy boots scuffed from decades of use. His smile creased his face deeply when he saw me. I helped him walk to a sandy patch a short distance from the road, no more than 50 yards away. He pointed with his cane. "Right here," he said. "Pulled a beauty out of this spot last summer." I set him down carefully and handed him his tools, a small pick, a shovel, and a canvas bag. We worked quietly at first, the scrape of metal against sand the only sound between us. After a while, I asked, "How's the view from the tower been?" "Clear most mornings," he said. Then, after a pause, "Though last night was strange." I looked up. Strange how? He heard someone walking around the base of the tower, slow steps. He chuckled softly, shined my light down, didn't see a thing. The afternoon stretched on. By around 3 o'clock the sun had shifted, shadows lengthening across the sand. "Doc," I called, "we should head out. I'll get the car ready." "All right," he said. "Let me finish this hole." I walked back to the car, brushed dirt from my hands, and stowed my tools. It couldn't have taken more than 15 minutes. When I returned, I expected to see him just where I'd left him. The sandy patch was empty. His small, careful hole was there, neat and shallow, but Doc was gone. So were his tools. The ground around the spot looked undisturbed. No scuffed earth, no fresh footprints beyond the faint impressions he'd already made. No broken branches, no signs of a struggle. "Doc," I called. The words seemed to vanish into the trees. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I searched behind nearby rocks down the slope, calling his name louder each time. Nothing answered me back. My hands were shaking when I ran for the tower. The door was unlocked, just as he always left it. Inside, everything was in its place. His bed neatly made, his coffee cup washed and drying on the counter. The radio sat on the table, turned on. I grabbed it. "Base, this is Devil's Head," I said, my voice unsteady. "Doc is missing. He was outside digging. He's gone." There was a pause. "Say again?" I repeated, "He's gone. His tools, too. I need help now." While I waited, I searched again, shouting his name until my throat burned. An hour passed, then another. The light began to fade, and the forest grew darker, deeper. That's when I heard a branch snap. Another snap followed, closer this time. "Who's out there?" I shouted. Then the steps resumed. I backed toward the tower, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. Between the trees, something moved. A figure stepped into view. Tall, wearing a dark jacket, face swallowed by shadow. He stood still, watching me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. After a moment, he turned and slipped back into the trees, vanishing as quietly as he'd appeared. I locked myself inside the tower and didn't come out until search teams arrived that evening. I told them everything. They brought dogs, ran grids through the forest all night and for days after. The dogs took Doc's scent from a shirt he'd left behind and then stopped cold. No trail, no direction, nothing. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. People nearby shared what they could. A hiker mentioned a strange truck parked along the road that afternoon, but couldn't remember the plates. Others talked about odd noises at night around the lookout, things moving where nothing should have been. Days turned into weeks. Doc never came back. His wife called me from home, her voice breaking. "He couldn't walk far," she said. "Someone must have taken him. Someone had to." I stayed on for a while after that, but nights became unbearable. I'd hear footsteps circling the tower, slow and patient. Once I shined my light into the trees and caught eyes reflecting back at me, low to the ground, steady, wrong. Eventually, I left. The Forest Service added extra checks for the lookouts after Doc disappeared, but his case is still open. No answers, no body, just an empty patch of sand at Devil's Head.